So,
Please, at least what we can do is welcome Adina Hicks.
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. So, and I did fail to provide Rick with a bio, but I'm the former executive director of Protect Our Gun Rights. I worked for the NRA on the No on 594 campaign, and kind of consistently through there, I've been a volunteer for the NRA. It's called Elections Volunteer Coordinator. And basically, I kind of talked myself into these jobs because I was working as a session aide for one of our state senators when 594 they were having hearings on it in Olympia. And we were getting a lot of emails that said, we need stronger gun laws. And I thought, well, what the heck is this? And I read it and I said, oh my gosh. Frankly, my first thought was Nazi Germany. Seriously, because what Hitler did was he registered the Jews, he registered their firearms, he confiscated them, and then he imprisoned the Jews. So, and Germany is not the only example of that. So, as soon as you can't lobby when you're staff in Olympia, so as soon as session was over, I started making phone calls, and I called the NRA and I said, what are you guys doing about this? And I called the Second Amendment Foundation, I said, what are you guys doing about this? And then I realized, wait a minute, what can I do about it? Okay, I have just as much responsibility as a gun owner and as a citizen to do something about this. So that's basically my background. Right now, I'm kind of on hiatus. My mother is not doing very well, and I'm kind of her main caregiver. But I do plan to go back, and I used to practice law. I always call myself a recovering lawyer. But I think I can do a lot more good if I can help people with their property rights, and not just land use, but also their rights in their firearms. So what I came to talk to you tonight about is the fact that, you know, in Genesis 1:28 in the Bible, God gave man dominion over the earth. He said to subdue it. In some translations, that means to govern it. Through conquest and birth of progeny of the conquerors, man gave that dominion to government. So we have always given ourselves over to government to say, there are certain things you need to do to take care of us. Now, in the year 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. That's when King John was forced to say that he would not levy taxes without the consent of his legislature, and that free man could not have his liberty or his property taken without a trial, or we call it due process. So then, of course, we have the United States Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, that said that we have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Eventually, the Constitution came along and the Bill of Rights. Those gave us a basic, we call it the floor of our constitutional rights. And our states are able to make those constitutional rights stronger. So here in Washington State, and yes, some people do not know, we do have a state constitution. Unfortunately, they don't teach it in school. Justice Sanders told me a story about he was asked to speak on the state constitution. He looked at a few textbooks, and two of them didn't mention it at all, and one of them just said, yeah, the state constitution is very long. So it's really a pity, because we do have a great constitution here in the state of Washington. So the constitution that deals with our property rights, or our rights in property, is Article 1, Section 16, which says that no private property shall be taken for private use. And when it's taken for public use, there has to be just compensation first. Well, the reason we have such a strong Constitution, such a strong section of that Constitution with our property rights is that the Fifth Amendment only tells us of the United States Constitution that private property will only be taken for public use with just compensation. So that's kind of the floor. And then we get to the Washington State Constitution, gives us a higher level of protection. Well, there was a federal case called Kelo versus New London. Are you familiar with that case?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I think anybody that has anything to do with property rights knows that case. Okay, and that case was really sad because the United States Supreme Court said, well, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution just says public use, and well, we think economic development is good enough for the public use. So a lot of people had their property stripped away from them. Yeah, they got paid for it, but there was a lot more to that case. And we say, well, could that happen here in Washington State? We have a stronger Constitution than our federal rights. Well, there's a couple of cases that go to show that our government doesn't always do what it's supposed to do when it comes to our rights. So we've got the Seattle Popular Monorail Authority case. Do you remember that, the sinking ship case? Okay, the only thing that saved the property owners in that case was the fact that the Seattle Popular Monorail Authority became not so popular, and basically they were voted out of existence. But prior to that was the Washington State Convention Center. They wanted to put a sky bridge. And so if you're on Union and you're looking north, you'll see the sky bridge. Well, what the government needed was an aerial easement and then a support easement. But in that case, our state Supreme Court, the majority said, no, the footprint of that easement now goes from heaven, basically, down to hell, each of those two bits. And that established some very bad case law. So we have a government now that is taking more than it needs, and it's infringing on our constitutional rights more than it should be. So when it comes to the Second Amendment of the federal Constitution says that a person shall have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of their country, and it shall not be impaired. Our Washington State Constitution is much stronger. It says that an individual citizen's right to keep and bear arms in defense of self or of the state shall not be impaired. Well, there's been things happening, not only federally, but right here in Washington State, that's affecting our right to keep and bear arms. And believe me, your right to keep and bear arms, your firearms are your private property. The house that you own is your private property. And the government is infringing more and more on these rights. Well, so here in Washington State, we passed 594. Remember that? Okay, it was supposed to be, you know, for gun safety. Keep guns out of the hands of criminals. Well, really, what 594 was, it was really a registration scheme. So, and this goes to the New York case. So, 594 was not about background checks or keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. Believe me, the criminals did not wake up on November 5th and say, oh my gosh, we just passed a new background check law. So, before I trade this stolen handgun for that crack cocaine, let's run down and get a background check. And oh, by the way, since it's a handgun, we better go to the Department of Licensing and register it. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. But it was a scheme to register every firearm in the state of Washington. Well, some people say, well, what's wrong with registering firearms? We have to register our cars. So yeah, well, when was the last time the government came in and tried to confiscate your car? Unless you were like a DUI or vehicular homicide, right? Government's not going to come and confiscate your car, but they will come and confiscate your firearms. So it happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. emergency order was issued, and it said all firearms should be turned over to the police or they're going to be confiscated. So the police were literally asking people as they were fleeing their homes, do you have any firearms? Well, guess what? The good law-abiding citizen said, yes, officer, I sure do. And the officer said, too bad, give it to me. It took some people 5 years and longer to get their firearms back from the government. Criminals didn't turn over their guns, right? And that's what happens when the government comes and confiscates our firearms. The law-abiding citizens are left without their property, without the right to defend themselves. You know, your Second Amendment right is actually a fundamental right. Now, unfortunately, the courts don't seem to treat it that way, even though in recent cases, they've been stating that the right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right, just like your First Amendment right, which means that you shouldn't have to be prosecuted to challenge the law, the constitutionality of the law. Unfortunately, it still happens. So now here in Washington State, you know, we have an RCW that says, in the event of an emergency, the governor will sign an order, and all of your firearms now, you do not have the right to have your firearms. They'll be confiscated. With the scheme of 594, and which is now codified in 9.41.113, if you want to read it, the government can come in and confiscate your firearms. You need to register all your handguns. Now, long guns are not specifically included in that registration, but if you have to go through a dealer, so the way 594 was set up was that if you wanted to transfer a firearm privately, you'd have to go to a dealer. The dealer has to take that firearm into inventory, charge you a fee, do a background check on the person you're transferring it to, and then eventually they get the gun. Okay, so, and it's a very, very broad scheme. So there's no 30-day limit. I mean, even California has 30-day. They have universal background check, but they have a 30-day exemption. So like if your brother wanted to borrow your shotgun to go duck hunting, okay? In California, you could actually just give him that shotgun and he could go duck hunting and he could give it back to you. The way the scheme works here in Washington State, you have to take that firearm to a dealer. Dealer takes it into inventory, charges a fee. Eventually, your brother gets the gun to go duck hunting, hopefully. Now, he can't just return that gun to you. It's your property. It's your property. He has to now take it to a dealer. Dealer takes it into inventory, charges a fee, does a background check on you, and then eventually you get your shotgun back. So the way with rifles and shotguns and so forth, you have to fill out a 4473 form, which is a federal form. Now on the form it says that the dealer's supposed to keep it for 20 years, but the dealers tell me all the time, that's not what ATF says. ATF says you have to keep that documentation until your store closes, and then you have to ship it all to the ATF. Well, the fact is, if you were ever concerned about the NSA gathering your metadata on your cell phone, let me tell you, the 4473 asks for your name, your age, your gender, your race, your home address. They do ask for your social security number. You don't have to give it to them, but they do ask for it on the form. Those forms are kept, and at any time, they can be confiscated by the ATF. Go through. So basically, it's a more difficult form of registration, but it's registration nonetheless. And again, registration has always led to confiscation of your firearms. Now, we had the issue in New York, talking about Buffalo, New York, where the police were, and New York has very strict gun laws, okay? New York, Chicago, Detroit, any of the places that have the highest crime rate and the highest homicide rate have the most draconian gun laws. which of course flies in the face of all these other gun control restrictions that they keep trying to implement in all these states and all these cities where we don't have the most draconian type of gun laws. But the police are looking at death certificates and gun registration. Like Rick said, going literally door to door, saying, you know what, you're not smart enough, you're not a good enough person to handle these firearms after the death of your husband, wife, spouse, you know, children, whatever. You don't have the capacity to deal with it. Well, what they want is they want to get all those firearms off the street. They're not compensating the families for the cost of those firearms. Here in Washington State, there was a widow. She had a number of firearms. She didn't want them in her house anymore. She wanted to give them to her husband's best friend after her husband passed away. She couldn't find a dealer that would do the private transactions for her because the dealers were saying, look, the government has not given us enough information for us to process these private requests, and we're concerned that we're going to get our license pulled. She went through 7 or 8 dealers before she finally found someone that would take it on and do the transfers for her. Now, the government didn't pay for all those transfers. Cost her about $50 per transfer, per firearm, to get that done. Government's not compensating for that. When the government comes and confiscates your firearms, you're a law-abiding citizen. They're not going to confiscate you. They're not going to compensate you for that loss. So, which leads me to the final point. The real reason I want to be here is the fact that we're allowing this to happen. And when I say we, now I understand, you guys are my 2.5%ers, okay? Seriously, 2.5% of people that are registered to vote actually get involved. 2.5% are the ones that run for office, volunteer in campaigns, donate to campaigns. This last election, we had 38.45% turnout. That's pathetic. It is really pathetic. And, you know, some good things happened. So we gained 1 more seat. The Republicans gained 1 more seat in the House. Terry Hicks from the 30th District was elected. And like Glenn said, this next election, 2016, is absolutely crucial. If you really do want to maintain your rights, if you want to make Cindy's job easier, what you need to do is you need to start getting other people involved. You need to ask your friends and family to register to vote. You need to make sure they do vote. Okay? To me, voting is one of the most sacred duties that we have, because that is the only way we can control the government, and it's the only way that we can protect our God-given rights in property, in our life. So, one of the things I want to point out is these cases that we talked about, the Seattle Popular Monorail case and the Washington State Convention Center case, and there will be more coming down the pipe with policing, because right now there's a challenge, although it's in federal court, to 594. It's being appealed right now. But the fact is, you need to not just be watching, you know, who your legislator is. You need to start looking at these state Supreme Court races, the judicial races. It's a little bit more difficult to figure out who these people are, but there's something called a telephone. And you can call them and talk to them and ask them their opinions. Now, judges are rather limited, because if it was something that was going to come before them in court, then maybe they can't answer. But I think you can generally get a good idea if you look who's endorsing them, you talk to people, get a feeling for these people. Because the fact is, your state Supreme Court, that's like your last chance. Okay, they have the last word. There are very few cases that make it to the United States Supreme Court. But we have it right here. Now, there was a new Elway poll out that showed that 45% of people identified themselves as conservative, while only 40% identified themselves as liberals. And I've been saying all along, there are really more conservatives in the state of Washington than there are the liberals. But the conservatives tend to disenfranchise themselves because they don't exercise their right to vote. They think their vote doesn't count. And I, again, tell people all the time, believe me, the only vote that doesn't count is the vote that you don't cast. Ask Dino Rossi. After 3 recounts, he won the first 2 times. The last recount, he lost by 129 votes. And he told me the other day, he said, I couldn't believe how many people came up to me and said, gee, Dino, I would have voted had I known it was going to be that close. Yeah. The fact is, we do need to vote. We need to get out there. We need to be doing all we can. There was a gentleman in Kitsap County. I wanted to give this man a medal. He went out in 2014 and he knocked on 28 doors. 28 people. Hopefully he knew them at least somewhat. I think it was in his neighborhood. And gathered ballots. People that had just left their ballots sitting out, hadn't mailed them, hadn't taken them to a drop box. 28 ballots. And I thought, my gosh, if we could multiply that, I mean, just by the number of people that are in this room, can you imagine if everybody would do that, if everybody would take their responsibility seriously, we could change the face of the legislature. 2016 is a very, very important year. Very important year. We're this close to having a solid majority in the House. We have a majority in the Senate. Okay? We're a little bit further from having the governor that we want. But I don't know if any of you know Bill Bryant. I'm going to put in a plug for Bill Bryant because I've known Bill for years. I knew last year, I just knew it when I heard him speak, that he was going to run for governor. We've got to support the candidates that are going to support and respect our rights. So, I don't know if anybody probably talked too long. It's so hard, there's so many things to talk about, so many things to say.
I have a question. Connecticut, before New York passed some draconian law, and there were actually talk about actually confiscating the guns, and then it kind of got put on hold. What's the status of that in Connecticut?
Okay. Well, so only about 4% of people actually registered their guns in Connecticut, and a lot of people that didn't register their guns were the police officers. So the police actually balked at going door to door to confiscate firearms. They, but it's happened. I told you it happened in New Orleans. It's happened in California. It happened in New York.
But it's only not happening by default, not because by design.
Yeah, and like I said, the only reason it didn't happen really in Connecticut is the police said, "Whoa, we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna go to law-abiding citizens," because again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that the criminals are not going to go register their guns. They don't. Criminals just don't do that.
Your reference to the provision in RCW to confiscate, declare, I assume under martial law, was that incorporated in 594? Is that how?
No. That was actually there before 594. It's RCW 46. It's in Title 46. I apologize. My only excuse is I'm just getting over. I had something like flu-like thing earlier this week, so I'm
Is that been there since the Constitution was written, you're saying, or is that?
No. That RCW, I couldn't tell you the year that was put in place, but it's one of those sleepers. It's something that people just don't even know are there. But it is, like I said, it's in Title 46. For some reason I can't remember that.
That's motor vehicles?
What?
Title 46 is motor vehicles?
Maybe it's Title 42.
Everybody should be reading all the titles we have anyway.
Yeah, but, you know, I mean, the sad thing is that there are volumes and volumes and volumes.
This can only, this requires a declaration of martial law, though, right?
Yeah, it's declaration of emergency, yeah.
Of course, everything's an emergency now.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, we have volcanoes and we have earthquakes and.
The
you know,
Mariners.
There's, what?
The Mariners.
Yes, Justice Sanders was involved in the case where I'm sure you guys remember the stadium case where the city of Seattle, the voters like rejected the tax, you know, to build the stadium. So then they took it to the entire state legislature and they passed the bill, and of course they put that a little emergency clause. And so when the assistant attorney general was arguing in front of Justice Sanders, she said,
Yeah.
he said, well, if it's an emergency, which is it, you know? And she's like, I'm sorry, Justice Sanders, I should just let you tell that part.
Well, the legislature had a special session because the Mariners had threatened to leave town, and they passed a bill funding the construction of the Mariners Stadium and putting a clause on the end of it saying this is immediately necessary to preserve the public peace, health, or safety, which is the language in the state constitution provision regarding referendums. It says you can have a referendum on anything except that which is immediately necessary to preserve the public peace, health, or safety. So petitioners went out, got some referendum signatures, presented them to the Secretary of State, who rejected them, saying, no, this is not subject to a referendum because it's because of this emergency clause. It went to the state Supreme Court, and the Assistant Attorney General argued that this was an emergency because it was necessary to preserve the public peace, health, or safety, and therefore it was exempt from the referendum power of the people. And my question to her was, well, is it one of those things, or is it all of those things? And she said, well, Justice Sanders, it's all of those things: public peace, the health, the safety. And I said, well, who's going to get sick if the Mariners leave? She said, well, Justice Sanders, you don't really understand what this is all about. And I guess not, because most of my colleagues agreed with the Attorney General.
I have the RCW. I have the RCW reference. No, it's 4306 222 or 220, and then it's actually E. And it basically it's called State of Emergency Powers of Governor Pursuant to Proclamation.
Thank you. Sorry, I was totally off. I haven't looked at one in a while, but yeah. But the fact is, it's there. People don't realize or recognize that we have something like that on the books. And what are you going to do? You're a law-abiding citizen, and a police officer comes up to you and says, "Do you have any firearms?" After we've had an earthquake or what?
Lie.
Well, it makes you wonder. What?
I'll lie.
What?
Has the police ever lied to you?
Adina, do you have some information on the presence of guns, concealed weapons permits, and that sort of thing? For instance, in Kennesaw, Georgia, the requirement to have firearms in the family, in the home, and the crime rate.
Yes.
And John Lott's book.
Yeah. What is it? More guns, less crime.
More guns, less crime.
Yeah.
Do you have any statistics?
I don't have any stats on that, but I can tell you that their crime rate is practically zero.
You're talking about Kennesaw, Georgia?
Yeah. And here in Washington State, it's been amazing to see our concealed weapons permits are hovering right around 500,000 permits now in the state of Washington.
Well, they've
Now-
increased greatly since 594.
Yes, it has. And, you know, part of that, people, although there's not really, the only exemption there is that you don't have to wait 10 days. So they increased the waiting period from 5 days to 10 days in 594. If you have a concealed weapons permit, then you're allowed to, you know, get a handgun. You don't have to wait the 10 days. I thought, okay, my time's done.
No.
So you don't have to wait for it. But that's not really, I don't think that is the reason that people are starting to recognize that they need to defend themselves. It's been a long-standing principle, the police really do not have a duty to protect you individually. That goes way back to a case in New York where literally the police basically didn't show up when someone was being beat to death.
The word
So-
policy.
What?
The word policy comes from the banking world.
Ah. So you really are responsible for defending yourself. And that was one thing, and it was DC, I had New York on the brain. But the police chief in DC said recently that with everything that's happening in the world, that people need to defend themselves. And when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, in New York, they won't even give you a permit. It is practically impossible to get a concealed weapons permit in New York. And yet, you know, what do we see there? We see a lot of crime, a lot of homicides.
Chicago too.
What? Chicago too. And the sad thing is that in Chicago, there was a case, the McDonald case, which actually was after Heller. So Heller was a case in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., you basically could not have a firearm. You could have one in your house, but you couldn't take a firearm with you anywhere. And that was ruled as a violation of the Second Amendment. But it was only applying to the District of Columbia. So then there was a McDonald case in Chicago where Mr. McDonald was an African-American gentleman, not a felon, hasn't been committed to a mental institution. He saw the crime occurring in his neighborhood and he became in fear for himself and his property. So he wanted to get a handgun. Well, in the city of Chicago proper, to get a handgun, you had to get a permit, but they weren't issuing any permits, so they were effectively denying him the right to purchase a handgun. So he sued. It was the Second Amendment Foundation, and I think the NRA had a hand in that one too. And the court held that that was a violation, that they were effectively impairing his right to keep and bear arms because they required a permit, but they weren't issuing any permit. And, you know, and that's just another way that the government does it. Yes?
Well, I was going to say, it was sort of a positive aftermath of that, because Illinois was the only state that didn't have any mechanism for concealed carry. And the Supreme Court ordered them to create
Well,
a mechanism.
they did have a mechanism. It was just one of those, unless you...
Who you knew.
Yeah, who you knew, and maybe how much money you had, or whatever palms you could grease. And after McDonald, their concealed weapon permit, boy, it just skyrocketed because they became a shall issue state. So the difference between a shall issue state and a may issue state, the may issue state is if they like you, or if you've got enough money, or if you're popular enough, or you know the right people, you can get a concealed weapons permit. If you're just normal Mr. Joe Schmo, you're not going to get a permit. Some interesting facts. So when Florida became a shall issue state, crime rate dropped dramatically. This was back in the 90s. Okay, crime rate dropped dramatically, but then it went up against tourists because tourists were driving rental cars that were marked. Okay, so the criminals said, hey, they probably don't live here, so I bet they don't have a gun. So as soon as they removed the marking though from their rental cars, the crime rate went down again because
2 years
the
ago.
criminals couldn't figure out. Criminals hate it when somebody's gonna shoot back. They really do. That's why they love gun-free zones. That's why you see all these problems in schools and like the Aurora Theater. Do you know that the Aurora shooter actually researched the theaters and he found out that that one was a gun-free theater, so no one would shoot back. Gun-free zones, frankly, are the most dangerous places on earth. Richard and I went to a movie and they wanted to search my bag. And I said, is this a gun-free theater? Because they didn't have any signs up. She said, yes. And I looked at Richard, I said, we're never coming back here because I'm in fear for my life. You know, I mean, it's sad, but it's true. The fact is that the places where law-abiding citizens can carry their firearms are the safest places you're going to be, because the police aren't going to be there. We don't want the police to be on every street corner. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'd feel pretty creepy if there were armed guards, you know, every 500 feet down the street. I don't want that. I don't want a police state. I want to take responsibility for myself, and I want you to be able to take responsibility for yourself. So, again, it's all going to come down to voting, though, because I can tell you, no matter how strongly you feel about it individually, like Glenn said, there's more power in numbers, and we need to be able to contact our legislators. We need to be able to say, look, I vote, I'll work for you, but you have to protect my rights. You have to respect my rights. Did I cover everything?
Yes. We've got a couple of things.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's the other. France also, it's practically impossible to own a firearm in France. Practically impossible. And had there been someone there, maybe, that was armed, there wouldn't have been 130 some odd people killed.
I think it's not all of France. There's a division between the rural areas and the urban areas. Paris has strict laws. If you have a firearm, you're able to shoot ducks in France. In the countryside, I don't think it would be bothered. At least that's my impression.
Well, the firearms, I think that most of the firearms that used were very illegal in Paris and in France in general. And that's usually the way it is. The criminal element, the people that want to do bad things, they're not going to have any problem getting those guns in. And again, countries, like in the United States, we have about 330 million firearms floating around. There's almost one gun for every person. Literally, like 9 out of 10 people could own a firearm if we had an even distribution of all the firearms. The fact is, the United States is one of the most safe countries in the world. So in the countries where firearm ownership is low, they have a high crime rate. Maybe they can say, oh, there's not much gun violence, but the fact is, you know what? People find other ways of killing other people. They find other ways of killing themselves. I think I would rather have a low crime rate, low murder rate, and high firearms ownership.
Is there any truth to it that the Chinese government, when he was over here, they asked or told Obama to make restrictions on gun ownership?
Well, I don't know about that in particular. I do know that there are there's a UN treaty, and I know Alan Gottlieb has spent a lot of time in Geneva trying to fight the UN gun treaty, because basically what they want us to do is they want to be able to, this world government basically wants to be able to control our firearms. rights. And I think that that's absolutely atrocious because we are the United States, we have the United States Constitution, and our rights are protected under that Constitution, and I don't think that world government should have the right to do that. And that's another thing you can do is write your senators federally. I just got an NRA alert today about that. Now I did hear on the way here though, I think it's being rejected in Congress anyway, but you ought to let your feelings about your rights be known.
Okay, well, thank you, Adina. Okay, so we've got a little extra time. We're going to play a video here that, how many of you know Bill Whittle? Bill Whittle? Okay, so we're going to play the video. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay. It's called #1 with the Bullet.
You've heard his comment on guns, is that what you got for you?
Yeah, Bill Whittle.
Yeah, on guns, though.
Yes.
Awesome, that's a good one.
Yeah, well, I think it's just about downloading, but let me just mention a couple of things. We talked about Kennesaw, Georgia briefly. Does everyone know the story of Kennesaw, Georgia? So it would have been probably about, I'm not sure what it was, 1982, 87, somewhere in the 80s, I think. They were alarmed by some gun regulations that had taken place in other places, and so Kennesaw said, well, no, we want to go the other way. We want to require all homeowners to own a firearm. And now they've never enforced.
Every head of household is the way they worded it.
Every household.
Head of household.
Every head of household. Yeah, now as far as I know, no one's ever been arrested. There's never been any real enforcement of it. But the law's on the books. And the amazing thing is that the crime rate took a nosedive after that. Because who's going to break into a house if you know that people are armed, right? And it's continued. Now, what's also happened is that the population has greatly increased in Kennesaw over the years because people feel safe there, right? And yet, even though the population was increasing a great deal, the crime rate has continued to be lower than surrounding communities and other places. Daryl?
Well, I was going to say there's a corollary to that, to an environment that supports private gun ownership, and that means they also have a philosophically they support the right to protect yourself. You go into an area where they're anti-gun, it's generally full of mindless cretins that are more worried about the perpetrator than the victim. So you're going to have support in court. So not only do the criminals know you may be armed, but you know that you will probably be facing somebody who knows they're in pretty good shape to shoot you and come out looking good in court.
So thank you. So there's some impressive statistics related to gun ownership in our country and other places also. Bill Whittle had this program. I think this is the right one. Can you? Will this play on the microphone now, or do we need to just need to plug it in? Okay. So you can't hear me now, right? Okay, so we're plugged in properly.
Barack Obama has proclaimed amnesty for millions of illegal aliens. Conservative clinics have called this act illegal, saying the president does not have the power to unilaterally circumvent Congress on the issue.
That's still on the website. I can't hear it. It's here, I can't hear it.
And that was before Congress.
You know, every time there's a shooting in America, our moral betters on the left immediately ammo up the assault rifle of their rhetorical arsenal, namely our country's sick, twisted obsession with personal firearms, our adolescent psychosexual, dangerous and frankly embarrassing when facing our European film critic friends, American gun culture. So, hopping over to the ever-reliable Wikipedia, for example, we discovered that when it comes to per capita gun ownership, the USA does in fact top the list in glory. When measured as the number of guns per 100 residents, the US comes in first at 90. 90 guns per 100 residents. Evidence for the progressives on the left that they do in fact live in the murder capital of the world, because when it comes to gun ownership, America is number one with a bullet, with by far the highest per capita gun ownership in the world. 90 guns per 100 people is half again more than the number 2 spot, held by Serbia with 58. Now, all we have to do to prove the left-wing progressive weenie case for banning guns is to do a quick search for the per capita murder rate. And sure enough, leading the number 2 country, again by about half again more, with 90 murders per 100,000 people is Honduras. Socialist gun-controlled Honduras. Because even though America has by far the highest per capita gun ownership rate, we do not have the highest per capita murder rate. And unfortunately for the progressive leftist argument, we're not second either. Or third. In fact, when it comes to per capita murders, Team USA didn't even make the top 5. As a matter of fact, we didn't even make the top 10. Or the top 20. Or the top 30. Or the top 40. We're not in the top 50 per capita murders. Gun Culture America is not in the top 60 nations in terms of per capita murders, or the top 70, or even the top 80. Or the top 90. Of the 218 nations and territories listed for per capita murders, the United States of America, Murderville, USA, did not break the top 100. We are, with 4.7 murders per 100,000 people in 2012, number 111. 111th place puts us near the top of the bottom half of all the nations and territories in the world when it comes to total per capita murders, and virtually all, if not all, of those nations ranked higher than us are big state socialist utopias with stringent gun control laws. How tragically disappointing that must be for our moral superiors, and unfortunately for the left, it gets a lot worse because 111th place, America's murder rate of 4.7 per 100,000 citizens, is artificially much higher than it should be because it includes so many deadly, murderous, toxic places like number 1 on the list of highly gun-controlled, democratically governed since the Stone Age murder pits like Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, with strict gun control laws, has a per capita murder rate of 54.6 murders per 100,000 citizens. If Detroit were its own country, it would just beat Venezuela for second as the most murderous country in the world behind Honduras. America's 111th place, 4.7 murder per 100,000 people, also includes, in order, democratically controlled, heavily gun-controlled New Orleans with 53.2 murders per 100,000, St. Louis with 35.5, Baltimore with 34.9, Newark with 34.4, Oakland with 31.8, followed by Stockton 23.7, Kansas City 22.6, Philadelphia 21.5, Cleveland 21.3, Memphis 20.2, and Atlanta 19.0, and of course Chicago with 18.5 murders per 100,000 people per year. America's per capita average of 4.7 murders includes all of these high crime areas. The first city to appear in Gun Mad, Texas is Dallas, which isn't even in the top 20. America's overall average of 4.7 is as low as it is because of places like Plano, Texas. It's the last city on the list with a murder rate of 0.4. Now, having been to Plano, Texas several times, I can tell you with confidence that virtually every home in Plano, Texas has an entire arsenal of AR-15 assault rifles, 30-06 hunting rifles, they got 45s, 357s, they got 38s, they got 9mm, they have an assortment of 22s for the kids to practice with, not to mention every species of tomahawk, bowie knife, hunting knife, jackknife, bayonet, switchblade, they got pointy rocks, they got sharp sticks. The per capita murder rate in Gun Nut Central is 0.4 per 100,000. If the United States of America as a nation had the same murder rate as Plano, Texas, we would not be 111 out of 218. We'd be 211 out of 218, well below Switzerland at 0.6, half of Germany, Spain, and Denmark at 0.8 murders, and well below half of New Zealand, the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, France, and Australia. If all of America had the murder rate of the gun nut capital of gun culture USA, Plano, Texas, then America's per capita murder rate would be 1/4 of those murderous, violent, rampaging, death-worshipping Belgians with their horrific 1.6 murders per 100,000. So maybe it's not the guns. Maybe it's the people holding the guns. We now return you to your regular scheduled program. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to visit us at truthrevolt.org.
So, I'm sure you all captured it. The reason the statistic is even as high as it is in the United States is only because we're counting the totals from those places which already have stringent gun control laws. Daryl?
They also add in suicides. That's something they're not telling you. Half of all gun deaths.
Those were homicides in there.
Oh, they're only listing.
Yeah,
I apologize.
those are actually homicides. No, it's the other side that tries to lump in the suicides with the actual homicide rate to artificially inflate it.
Gun deaths, they call them.
Yeah.
Eric?
As an example of that, today's Seattle Times had this story about, well, it was related to San Bernardino, but it was the mass murder situations, which were defined two different ways. One is either 4 deaths at a time, or the other was 4 deaths or injuries. But in that story, one of the anti-gun people said, on average, we kill 88 people in the United States a year, which the math is pretty simple. If you go ahead and multiply that by 365 days a year, you're over 30,000 deaths. That is an example where they have confused homicides, which I just saw the FBI said there were, I think it was 2011 or 2014, something like that. There were only around 12,000 homicides a year in the United States. So they've included another 20,000 deaths, either by accident or by suicide or something else like that. When you see that number of 88 people a day being killed, that includes homicides and accidents and those sorts of things. I'm sorry, it includes, in addition to homicides, accidents, suicides, which are roughly 2/3 of all deaths by gun. All the United States.
Doctors are more dangerous than guns, so stay away from them.
It's very, very, very true.
So another statistic that is pretty carefully hidden, or maybe I shouldn't say hidden, but just not even visible, is the number of crimes that are prevented with a gun. They're not typically not even reported. Okay, so there's a person in SeaTac recently that described an incident. She heard something out front. She looked out her front window. In fact, she was on the 2nd floor of her house. Looked out the window, and there was someone trying to get into her car. So she just opened the window up and racked the slide on a shotgun. The person, it was dark, it was nighttime. They looked around, they heard that sound. And then she just said, "You better get out." And the guy took off running down the street just as fast as he could. And she said she thinks he probably will not be back.
So let me point out that you want to be real careful not to fire the shotgun, because that actually can lead to criminal prosecution.
If it's outside of your home, or
You're not physically friendly.
That's up to the police and the prosecuting attorneys to decide whether or not that's reckless or not.
Yeah, put milk and cookies out first.
I've heard, I don't know if this is true, someone that knows more about this would probably be better to confirm, but that if you actually use a gun in defense of your property, you can expect to be arrested, and that you better have some kind of defense.
Drag them in the door.
What's that?
Well, the forensics will know that.
No, Al Gore actually made a comment while he was sitting vice president, talking about firing a shotgun over somebody's head from the window. That's a good way to do.
Was that Al
Oh,
Gore?
Biden, Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Joe Biden said that, right.
Somebody
else did that and got prosecuted. I don't know whether or not they were convicted. I don't know whether they entered into some sort of plea agreement or something else like that. But for instance, the city of Burien has a misdemeanor discharge of a gun. period. Now, you may make a self-defense claim. Typically, self-defense requires proportionate response, and breaking into a car, it's not proportionate to fire a gun to prevent someone from breaking in a car, as most prosecutors and probably most juries will. My only point is you don't want to risk a jury of 12 second guessing whether or not what you did was reasonable in self-defense.
In a warm climate, you rock solid shotguns.
This is something I've asked several cops and lawyers, and generally the way Washington state law shakes out is that if you're in your domicile, if somebody comes in against your will, you have a lot of latitude to use deadly force, a lot of latitude. They always recommend saying, I was in fear of my life, but you don't have to prove anything other than that they came in against your will. You can't invite the Fuller Brush man in and shoot him. You can't. But if they came in either surreptitiously or by force, some states, like Massachusetts, you are required to escape. You can't fight. You're only allowed to fight if you're completely trapped in a corner and there's no possible way, and if you surrender, you're probably going to get hurt. Only then can you fight. In Washington state, if you're inside your home or in something that would be equivalent to your home, you have a tremendous latitude to use deadly force.
Yeah, so this...
Well, I was going to say, if you are outside of your home, you need a stronger case to show that you were in fear for your physical well-being, that you were in serious danger. But in your car, even on the street, if you're being attacked, you have a lot of latitude to defend yourself if you didn't do anything to instigate it. There was a case in Enos, Arden 3 years ago. A guy, 2 intruders in his house. He came downstairs, he shot one in the house, the other ran out the door, went over the fence, he shot that guy. They only tried him for the guy going over the fence. He was free and clear with the guy in the house. The jury decided to let him go, but that was completely up to the jury. But the one in the house, he had a pass on. So if you're within your domicile, you got a lot of latitude.
So,
Yes.
society,
Well, yeah, it's just we don't have a duty to retreat here in Washington State. So we don't have to go hide and lock ourselves in the bathroom and then have them break down the bathroom door to be able to defend our homes. But, you know, a lot of it comes down to what jurisdiction you're in. And some prosecutors, like I know the Pierce County prosecutor, Mark Lindquist, he's a gun guy, he concealed carries, and he has been absolutely stellar in self-defense cases, not prosecuting cases that were clear self-defense. Defense of property is kind of one of those iffy things. You know, sometimes you have to look at, because while you have a constitutional right to keep and bear arms, when you go out in public, anytime you're in public where there's innocence there, you have a much higher responsibility to make sure that those innocents are protected as well. So, and that may mean not shooting at someone, even though they've you know, taken your property or whatever. But you really need to be in fear of your life. So, and you never shoot to kill. You only shoot to stop.
wasn't remember was it the Virginia Tech case where there was if you know this case, please let me know, but I think it was Virginia Tech, wasn't it, where a gunman was there and someone had a gun in their car and they went out and got their gun and took them out. But there was not, technically it was not allowed to have guns on the campus. And so, but had it not been for that person that went and got their gun and brought it into the campus and shot the perpetrator, that probably would have been more people killed. And I don't know what happened to him, because he technically, he violated the rule of the university by bringing a gun. Does anyone know that? Okay, I believe that was,
It was Virginia Tech. I don't know the details on what happened to him.
Okay, but
I think it was an ex-military guy who had it.
But I described that correctly, right? He left campus, got it from his car or something.
I think so.
Okay. The point is, though, there's an awful lot of cases where guns prevent crimes without even being shot, without even being fired. So I think the numbers, the statistics that Bill was talking about on this video
or only the murders, actually the murders, and how much, and it's, the statistics are way on our side as far as being able to protect ourselves and our property with firearms. So, any other comments before we close?
You only showed that short part of the video, no, the same thing where he is speaking to the entire Congress. That, and what you saw there, and the camera flashes around the faces of all these characters that are gun collectors. It's powerful stuff.
I don't think I've seen that one. Is it the same bill? It's the
Same guy, same stats coming down, but the location was shown clearly.
Oh, okay. I'll have to look for that.
Just one more comment. The fact is that even though we have the statistics, the facts on our side, that draconian gun laws don't work, that we see it all around the world, not just here in the United States, there is an emotional element that the gun control crowd tries to push.
No purpose. Psychotropic drugs, 60 or 40 of them in 1966, better than 64 now. People, sane, healthy, normal people go see a doctor, and whether he's feeling this or that or a little suppressed or whatever, and boom, 3 days later, he murders his wife, daughter, and granddaughter, and himself.
Yeah, and
Cases like that is happening all the time.
Yeah, I've heard that argument too, that basically because there are so many drugs out there, because we know the Columbine shooters were on Prozac.
Yeah, but what was Senate talking about that very day?
What?
The Senate was talking gun control the day Columbine. This is set up inside job. They knew Harrison Cleveland over all these drugs and got them on that day. They timed these things very well for the emotional pitch, like guns.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
Adina, you continue, please.
well, the point is that even though they don't want to listen to the facts and the figures, they want to elicit some kind of emotion, which is really awful because, you know, there only 3 out of 10 registered voters voted yes on 594, and I can guarantee you 2 out of the 3 had no idea what they were voting for, but it sounded good, you know. And when after the Connecticut shooting, knee-jerk reaction was to, you know, impose stronger gun laws. After the Colorado shooting, knee-jerk reaction, impose stronger gun laws. But again, all it does is affect law-abiding citizens. It does nothing with reducing crime, and we can see that over and over, although no one's willing to say that there's a causal connection between draconian gun laws and...
The biggest enemy of the state is the truth, according to Joseph Goebbels.
Scott.
Have you ever talked about problem, reaction, solution in this meeting?
Don't remember, don't think so.
It's called the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution. Just look it up and ask yourself on any of these events what's really might be going on. And all of these shooting events, a lot of them lately, there are some commonalities. Either the shooter was on SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the mind-altering drug, psychotropic drug, and or there was coincidentally a drill planned simultaneously with the event.
I've heard.
Yesterday,
I remember that.
So,
Yeah.
And I was listening to the news last night. There was discussion about whether or not the shooters that were supposedly killed were wearing vests, bulletproof vests. And I don't know if this is true, I haven't verified it yet, but apparently there was a bill in Congress recently about outlawing individuals being able to buy bulletproof vests.
Yeah, we.
So why is it so coincidental that we have these events corresponding with legislative actions against our rights to purchase what we want to purchase? There's just a lot of questions out there, and a little more deep investigation is needed than what we'll hear on the mainstream media.
You didn't hear this one.
Well, in all the mass shootings that have happened in the United States over the last few years, every single shooter has passed background checks, gone through waiting periods. The guy in Santa Barbara, he even had limited capacity magazines. So there wasn't one gun law in the world that would have stopped him. What would have stopped him is if more Californians might have been, carrying concealed and been able to stop him before he started running people down and shooting them. So again, it goes to show, I think Connecticut, that young man, his mother had purchased all the firearms legally. He killed her and then broke in, got the firearms, and then shot the children at Sandy Hook. But again, it's over and over again, and Scott, I've actually heard that before, that there's some kind of weird connection, a corresponding event that has happened when these shootings.
Switch weird to orchestrated.
There's a whole list of events and drills that were coincident.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a website called John Rappaport.
Okay.
You can look it up.
Maybe the crime to question the government's response to the thing.
Daryl.
I would like to point one other statistic. If the number of guns correlate, every male in Switzerland, 18 and over, has a real assault rifle that goes full automatic and 100 rounds of ammunition. And maybe every 10 years somebody gets shot in the whole country.
Yeah, I think Switzerland has one of the lowest residential burglary rates.
Yes.
Yes. They got 100 rounds supplied by the state to take you out. If there's 2 or more, there's going to be a couple hundred.
But they have competitions all the time, all over the country too, for shooting.
Yeah,
I
had a picture of two young women, like young 20s or whatever, with what looked like ARs strapped on their backs, riding their bikes down the road, and I'm thinking, yeah.
Where was this, Adina?
Oh, it was something that popped up on Facebook, and I thought it was great. It was a picture of these two young women, probably late teens, early 20s, with ARs strapped on their backs, riding their bicycle. And I, basically the caption was, look at this, and Switzerland's one of the safest places, in the world.
Was that supposed to be in Switzerland?
Yeah.
The bikes, okay.
Yeah.
So in case anyone doesn't know, I think probably in Switzerland, I think it's every able-bodied male between the ages of 18 and 45 or something like that are considered part of the militia. And so they're required to be armed. They have arms at home. And so, who's going to break in there? It just doesn't make sense.
Does anybody know what the statistics might be on Australia when they gave up their guns since that time?
I'm sorry, say again?
Australia.
Yeah, okay. So
a lot of them gave up their
They did. And again, what happened? So all the registered firearms were confiscated. You were told that you had to turn them in. Of course, the criminals didn't. So criminals continued. The criminal element, the crime rate has just shot up. Burglaries, rapes, just like the UK. I mean, people always talk about how there's no guns in the UK. Well, gee, just look at their homicide rate, their rape rate, their home invasion rate. They're just absolutely skyrocketing because the criminals have no, people find themselves at a disadvantage to a well-armed criminal. One of the saddest cases in Australia was there was a shop owner who kind of skirted the law and didn't turn in his firearm, had an armed assailant come into his store. He ended up shooting the armed assailant, and guess who's going to prison? The shop owner, because he didn't turn in his firearm when Australia. So yeah, all you have to do, there's a lot of information out there on the internet that'll just show you, the travesty of what happens when you disarm your law-abiding citizens. And that's exactly what the gun control groups, they don't want gun safety. They don't want guns. I've had so many of them say, I think all guns should be banned. I think all guns should be illegal. And I said, gosh darn it, I think methamphetamine ought to be illegal. Oh, wait, it is. But people, but people still get it. The fact is, the criminals always find a way. So, that's why I say, if you don't speak up for yourself and your rights, and you just let willy-nilly get elected, you're going to find yourself in a similar situation where they're saying, okay, well, first we're going to register all the firearms, and then next we're going to come and confiscate them because we don't think that really you can handle it. We don't think you can handle firearms.
What is the police position?
Well,
they're the ones who are supposed to have monopoly authority over the use of firearms when it's not in self-defense.
Actually,
how do they feel about it in general?
It depends.
In the state of Washington.
Okay, so I'll tell you, it depends on the jurisdiction. Now, with 594, we had 29 county sheriffs come out publicly opposing 594 because they said, number one, it's really unenforceable. I mean, basically, it's just unenforceable. It's just going to take scarce law enforcement resources. What I have found in Lewis County Sheriff, Sheriff Snaza, who his twin brothers in Thurston County, but Sheriff Snaza, the new sheriff of Lewis County, he and the prosecutor came out after 594 passed and said, you know what, we're not going to chase around law-abiding citizens. If someone's truly breaking the law, basically they might tack it on, but they weren't even going to enforce it. There's a lot of police officers now that say they're not going to enforce it because they can't. They really can't. Sheriff Urquhart just came out, who was a supporter of 594 because he's in that kind of Seattle King County jurisdiction. He pretty much supported it, but now he's coming out saying, you know what, he wants his off-duty officers to carry firearms, and he thinks that people ought to be able to defend themselves with everything that's happening in the world. So it depends on where you're at. Police chiefs tend to be a little bit more liberal because they serve at the pleasure of the mayors of the cities, but the county sheriffs tend to be a lot more conservative, and you find the more conservative police say, you know what, I want you to go out and get your concealed weapons permit. I want you to be there in case of emergency because we can't be everywhere.
Except maybe King County?
Well, King County, King County should be its own state. Sorry, guys, I mean, I know you're, but the fact is, that King County, especially Seattle, they have tried instituting a tax now, $25 tax on the sale of firearms, and then every round that's sold, they're supposed to tax it 5 cents, which is now being constitutionally challenged because of the state preemption law. But Seattle wants to do everything it can to get rid of firearms. They tried to ban them from parks and things, and then and they were taken to task, taken to court, and the court said, no, there's a state preemption law. You can't make laws that are any stricter than our state laws. And so they lost that. They're probably going to lose this tax, this new tax that they have. But they really have been trying to do everything that they can to limit firearms ownership, which is going to make Seattle not very safe.
Okay, so according to mine, we've got 1 minute left. Daryl, you're the last.
I'd like to make one reference to some statistics that came out in the Seattle Times about 30 years ago in a previous incarnation of gun grabbing. And they pointed out that that Mexico had a per capita murder rate 5 times as high as the United States. And they had, handguns were virtually illegal. Only police and military had access to handguns, and long guns, rifles and shotguns were so highly regulated, you had to have it in with divine intervention just about to get them. Not quite that bad, but they were very strict. 75% of all murders were committed with knives. There's something that people lose sight of. Killing didn't start with the advent of the gun. I mean, there was a time when a rock and a stick were the state-of-the-art murder. And if you know, and I forget the rule, but there was a cop about 20 years ago did an analysis, and you will find most self-defense experts will point out to you that within 20 feet, a guy with a knife is the most dangerous opponent you can face. And if you have just a modicum of understanding of how to wield a knife, you are extremely dangerous if you're close. It's true that you can reach out and touch somebody with a gun, but with a knife, if you're close, you're deadly. You are dangerous. And they were using projectiles with arrows and spears, so you take away the guns, you still got a plethora of weapons to kill them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And they talk about suicides. The fact is that, yes, there are a lot of firearms used in suicides in the United States, but you take away the firearms, and the suicides are just by other means, suffocation, strangulation. I mean, people...
Like in Japan, which has a much higher suicide rate than the US does, and has no guns.
Right.
But they have swords. They'll make them.
Okay, so there's a couple other really cool things I could say, but I'm not gonna. Because we're out of time. So our next meeting is January 7th, right here. Lynn and Cindy will talk about our 2016 legislative agenda. Please, everyone, have a great Christmas and New Year. Thank you.
Merry Christmas.